There is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with sound. It is the silence of a person who has finally decided, after a very long time, to stop pretending they did not hear, to stop pretending they did not see, to stop making themselves small enough to fade into the walls of a house that was never theirs. That kind of silence is heavy. It builds slowly over years, and when it finally breaks, when the person carrying it finds a way to release it, the sound it makes can travel farther than a scream, farther than a gunshot, farther than anything else, because it moves through paper. What you are about to hear is the account of a woman named Dora. She was a cook on a sugar plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s. She spent nearly 20 years feeding a family that never once learned her last name. She stirred their pots, salted their meat, and listened to every word spoken in that house. Because when you are treated like furniture, people forget you are there. They told her nothing, yet they told her everything. And one night in the summer of 1857, for reasons that historians and archivists have argued about ever since, a bundle of handwritten pages was found hidden inside the false bottom of an oak chest in 1923. Dora had written it all down. Every secret, every name, every night she had pretended not to hear. This is her story. Stay with it until the end, because the most unsettling thing about what happened at Belhaven Plantation is not what Dora witnessed. It is what happened to the people who discovered she had written it. The Belhaven Plantation sat 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on land that had been cleared, drained, and made productive through decades of labor that its owner, Gerald Hatfield, preferred not to think about directly. He thought about the yields instead. He thought about the price of sugar in New Orleans, about the weight of barrels, about the patterns of weather and the health of the cane. He was a man who had trained himself to see the operation without seeing the human machinery that made it run, the way a person can look at a clock and read the time without ever thinking about the gears inside. Gerald was 53 years old in the summer of 1857. He had the broad, reddened face of a man who spent too much time on horseback under the southern sun, and too many evenings on his veranda with a glass of bourbon. He was not cruel in the way that suggests pleasure in cruelty. He was something more ordinary, and in many ways more dangerous. He was a man who simply did not look. He did not look at the people who worked for him. He did not look at the accounts his overseer kept in the gray ledger. He did not look at the faces of the women who carried his meals from the separate kitchen house, through the garden, and up the back steps into his dining room. Dora had been making that walk for 18 years. She had been brought to Belhaven in 1839, when she was around 19 years old. The records from the estate where she had lived before were incomplete, as records for enslaved people often were, more detailed about livestock than about human beings. She came to the plantation already knowing how to cook. Her previous mistress had run a kitchen that required precision, and Dora had learned that the kitchen was a place where skill could buy a certain kind of quiet authority. A cook who made poor meals was punished. A cook who made excellent meals was left alone to keep making them. She learned very early that excellence could be a kind of armor. By 1857, Dora was somewhere in her mid to late 30s. She managed the plantation kitchen with the focused efficiency of a woman who had long understood that the only space truly available to her was the one she carved out through her own skill. The kitchen house itself was a separate building behind the main house, a common arrangement in Louisiana plantations, both to keep cooking fires away from the main structure and to keep the people who did the cooking at a visible distance from the people who ate the food. The kitchen was about 40 feet from the rear entrance of the main house. There was a covered walkway, a pergola thick with jasmines that bloomed white and sweet from April through October. Dora walked that path many times each day, and the important thing about that path, the thing that mattered more than anyone who designed it ever considered, was that the rear windows of Gerald Hatfield's study sat directly above the back steps, where the path ended. Gerald conducted much of his private business in that study. He kept the windows open because the Louisiana heat was relentless, and because over 18 years he had completely stopped noticing Dora's presence, the way a person stops noticing the ticking of a clock in a room they have slept in for years. This was his most serious mistake. Dora had been born into a world that required her to make constant, quick calculations about what she knew, what she could say, and what she had to pretend not to know. This was not unique to her. It was the specific kind of intelligence that the system demanded from people in her position, a constant and exhausting alertness that went unrecognized because it was invisible, and because acknowledging it would have forced the people around her to admit it existed. She knew things about the Hatfield family that they believed only they knew. She knew that Gerald's eldest son, Philip, 26, handsome in the way of men who have always been considered handsome and have never had to do anything interesting with it, was 3 months behind on debts he had built up in New Orleans, debts his father did not know about. She knew this because Philip had received 2 letters in the spring of that year, and she had been standing at the bottom of the main staircase when he read them. The sound a man makes when he reads a letter that frightens him is distinct, and she had listened. She knew that Gerald's wife, Cecily, a thin, exact woman from a Virginia family that once had more land and reputation than money, and who had spent 20 years married to Gerald while quietly compensating for what she saw as a social disappointment, had been writing letters to her sister in Richmond that she did not send through the usual post. She sent them through a trusted friend in Baton Rouge, who mailed them from there. Cecily had mentioned this arrangement in a conversation with that friend in the parlor one afternoon, speaking in the lowered tones that polite Southern women used when they wished to be discreet, not realizing that lowered voices in a house with wooden floors and high ceilings travel differently than they expect, and that Dora had been in the hallway outside the door, carrying a tray. She knew that Gerald's younger son, Robert, 19, narrow and tense, with a nervous intelligence that made everyone in the household slightly uneasy, had been spending time in parts of the parish his father would not have approved of, meeting with people his father would have disapproved of, and reading documents that could have caused serious trouble for the entire family if they had come to the attention of certain men in Baton Rouge. She knew all of this the way a river knows the shape of its banks, quietly, constantly, without being asked. And she kept it the way water holds the shape of a vessel, perfectly and without effort. For 18 years, what Dora knew stayed inside her. It had no outlet. It had nowhere to go. She was a cook on a plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s, and the idea that she might share what she knew with anyone who could use it was so impossible that it barely formed as a thought. It was simply weight, something she carried until the summer of 1857, when 3 things happened in quick succession that changed what she carried from weight into something sharper, something dangerous. The first thing happened in June. A man arrived at Belhaven who had not been expected. His name was Cyrus Holt, and he described himself as a business associate of Gerald Hatfield from Memphis, come south on a matter that required discretion. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, on horseback, carrying a leather satchel he kept close to him at all times, and with a manner that Dora, who had long experience with the difference between men who were truly comfortable and men pretending to be, immediately recognized as the latter. Gerald received Cyrus Holt in his study with the windows open, because it was June in Louisiana, and the alternative was suffocating heat. Dora walked the jasmine path 3 times that afternoon. She did not slow down. She did not position herself under the window. She simply walked at her usual pace, carrying what she needed to carry. And she listened to what the open window gave her, because she had learned long ago that the best way to hear things was to appear as if she was not listening at all. What she heard, in fragments, the natural fragments of someone passing beneath a window rather than standing still, was enough. Cyrus Holt had come about a debt. No, T. Phillips' debt, which was the kind of debt a young man gathers from drinking too much and playing cards badly. This was something different, something larger. Gerald Hatfield had, it seemed, entered into an arrangement years earlier with a group of men whose business interests were, in the language of 1857 Louisiana, irregular. The arrangement had been profitable for some time. It was no longer profitable, and the men Cyrus Holt represented were not patient men. And the number that drifted through the open window and reached Dora's ears as she walked beneath it was large enough that she felt something she had not expected. She felt afraid for the family, not because she cared for them exactly, but because of something more complicated than care. It was the fear of a servant for the household, the understanding that if the house falls, everyone inside it falls in different ways, but everyone still falls. She carried the food inside and said nothing. The second thing happened in early July. It involved Robert. Robert Hatfield had, for the past year, been quietly and carefully doing something that in 1857, Louisiana was not only socially unacceptable but dangerous. He had been attending meetings, not formal political gatherings, not the kind attended by men of his standing in town to discuss yields, tariffs, and prices, but different meetings, small gatherings in back rooms and private homes, the kind that left no public record, and that participants referred to only in indirect language in their letters. Dora had known about Robert's activities for several months. She had noticed the glances he shared with certain visitors. She had paid attention to which letters he opened first, before taking them to his father, and which ones he quietly slipped into his pocket. She had watched the pattern of his disappearances. But in early July, something shifted. A man arrived at the back of the kitchen house, not through the main door, not by the proper path that any rightful visitor would take, but from behind, through the vegetable garden in the late evening, when the light was fading and the house was settling into the routines before sleep. He was a thin man, older than Robert, with rough, worn hands, and a slow, careful way of moving. He had come to speak with Dora, not about Robert directly, but about something Robert was carrying. The man did not give his name, and Dora did not ask, because she understood that names in such conversations were risky things. He explained that Robert had taken something he should not have taken, something that had been trusted to the movement Robert had joined, and that this item needed to be returned or passed along without going through Robert, who had recently become unreliable in ways that worried the people who depended on him. The man asked Dora if she would be willing to help. She looked at him quietly for a long moment. She thought about the jasmine path, the open window, and 18 years of moving silently, hearing everything, and carrying it alone. She said she would think about it. The man left the same way he had come, through the vegetable garden, and Dora remained in her kitchen for a long while after, listening to the house settle in the heat. She was thinking, but also, for the first time in many years, remembering what it felt like to be asked. The third thing happened in the middle of July. It was the moment that changed everything, and it started with a conversation she was not meant to hear, in a place she was not meant to be, at a time when everyone in the main house believed she was in the kitchen. She was not in the kitchen. She was standing at the bottom of the back staircase, having come up through the rear entrance to replace the candles in the hallway sconces, a task she usually completed earlier in the day, but had been delayed because of preparations for a dinner that Gerald Hatfield was hosting that evening. It was after 4 o'clock. The hallway was dim, the shutters partly closed against the afternoon heat. The study door was not fully shut. Gerald and Cyrus Holt were inside. Cyrus had not left after his visit in June. He had stayed, which in itself was unusual, and his continued presence had created a quiet tension in the house that had been building for weeks. Gerald had told Cecily that Holt was assisting with business matters, and Cecily, whose intelligence was sharp, but whose access to her husband's affairs was limited by design, had accepted this explanation with the familiar expression of a woman who has learned not to ask questions, and has trained herself not to regret not asking them. But that afternoon, through the slightly open study door, what Dora heard was not about the debt she already knew existed. It was about a man living in Baton Rouge, a man who, according to Cyrus Holt, was asking questions he should not be asking. A man who had begun to look into a series of dealings that connected Gerald Hatfield to a group of men, the same men that Holt represented. These dealings had taken place over several years and involved matters that, if revealed properly to the right people, would completely ruin Gerald Hatfield and pull down several other men of similar status in the parish. Cyrus Holt explained, in a calm and precise voice, what he believed should be done about this man. Gerald Hatfield did not answer right away. There was a long silence. Then he spoke in a voice so low that Dora, standing at the bottom of the stairs, caught only part of it. But the part she heard was enough. She stood very still. She finished replacing the candles. She walked back down the hallway, out through the rear entrance, and along the jasmine path to the kitchen house. She stirred the pot for the evening meal. She added salt. She kept thinking about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. She thought about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked for her help. She thought about Philip's debts, Cecily's hidden letters, Robert's risky meetings, and 18 years of knowing, carrying and staying silent. And slowly, in the quiet back of her mind, she began to put things together. If you have been listening this far, stay with us, because what Dora had gathered over 18 years is about to become the most dangerous collection of knowledge you can imagine. And this is only the beginning. The truth about being invisible in a house is that you are not truly invisible. You are simply placed into a different category. You become furniture. You become a tool. You become part of how the house works. And tools are not expected to notice anything. So no one considers that they do. Dora had been noticing since 1839. She had a memory no one had ever praised, because she had never been given the chance to show it. She could recall conversations from years before with the accuracy of a court recorder. The exact words, the exact tone, even the silences between words, the silences that often said more than the words themselves. This was not a skill she built for any special purpose. It was something that grew out of need, the way any skill grows when it helps a person survive. By the summer of 1857, consider what Dora knew. She understood the full structure of Gerald Hatfield's financial life, not because anyone had explained it, but because financial worry is one of the loudest forces inside a house. It shows itself in the kind of meals requested, in the length of late conversations in the study, in the way a man carries his shoulders when he sits at the dinner table. She had watched Gerald's body reveal the truth his words would not admit for years. She knew that Belhaven had been mortgaged in 1853. She knew this because she had overheard Gerald dictating a letter to his clerk that spring, and because she had seen the clerk's face when he returned 3 days later after sending it. And when a man's face looks like that, the news is never good. She knew that the sugar harvest had been declining since 1854. She knew this from dinner conversations, from the way Gerald once spoke proudly and openly about the cane when yields were strong, compared to how he spoke in recent years, briefly and with a sense of avoidance, quickly changing the subject. She also knew that Gerald had been hosting men from New Orleans, who were not his usual kind of guests. She had served them. She had watched them closely. They arrived well-dressed and carried themselves like men used to being respected. But beneath that surface, there was something else, a patience that was not hopeful but certain. Over many years, Dora had learned to tell the difference. These men had come several times between 1853 and 1856. After 1856, they stopped coming. Instead, Cyrus Holt came. Dora noticed that difference. What Dora understood about Philip was, at its heart, the story of a young man who had been given everything except the ability to manage it. Philip Haverfield had grown up as the heir to a plantation, a position, and a level of social standing that came with owning land and being white in Louisiana during the mid-19th century. He had always known these things would be his, and that knowledge had given him confidence that seemed real, but was empty underneath, like a building that appears strong from the outside, while its structure inside is weak. He had gone to New Orleans at 18 and returned changed, not in obvious ways, not in ways his parents would have quickly seen, but changed in a deeper sense, like someone who had discovered something about himself that his family's world had no way to describe. Dora had seen it immediately. She noticed it in how he rushed through meals as if they were interruptions, and in how he moved restlessly through the house, always seeming to be on his way somewhere else, always ready to leave. Since then, he had been traveling regularly to New Orleans. He brought back gifts for his mother, excuses for his father, and debts that grew steadily with each visit, slow and certain like interest building over time. The men he owed money to were not the kind who waited forever. Dora understood this not because she had heard direct conversations about them, but because of the letters Philip received, letters he would read, and then immediately burn instead of leaving them on his desk. Dora knew the signs of burned letters, because she cleaned the fireplaces and burned paper leaves, a very specific kind of ash. By July of 1857, The ash in Philip's fireplace was building up in a way that told its own clear story. Cecily Haverfield was the most complex person in Dora's world, and the one Dora had spent the most time trying to understand. She was not a cruel woman. Dora had decided that years ago, with the careful judgment of someone who has observed closely for a long time. Cecily was a woman who had made her choices within the limited options available to women of her time and position, and she had made those choices efficiently, without showing regret, which is not the same as making them happily. She managed the household with near-perfect precision. Every surface in the house was kept to a high standard that required constant effort from those maintaining it. She entertained guests with grace that people remembered. She dressed with care, spoke with care, and handled the family's social ties with the attention of a skilled diplomat. But she was not happy. Dora understood this the way she understood most things about the household, through closeness and quiet observation. She could tell from the way Cecily sat at the breakfast table when Gerald had already left early in the morning, the distinct kind of stillness that settled over her. The way she held her coffee cup in both hands and stared out toward the garden, without really seeing anything at all. The letters to her sister in Richmond revealed more about Cecily than anything else, and they were also the most risky part, because the sister in Richmond was not replying through the usual routes either, and the letters that did arrive from the sister, coming only now and then, written in a hand that Cecily always took straight away, never leaving them on the front table where the rest of the mail was sorted, were not ordinary letters at all. Dora did not know their full meaning. She was not someone who read letters that were not meant for her, and in any case, Cecily kept them private in a way that made it difficult for anyone to access them. But Dora understood something about what they contained from Cecil's replies, from the way her posture shifted after reading them, the way she would sometimes go straight to the writing desk in the parlor and begin writing quickly, with a kind of urgency and energy that was not part of her usual way of writing. The sister in Richmond was helping Cecily plan something. Dora did not know what it was, but she had been watching the pattern for nearly a year, and in her experience, patterns always came together eventually into something clear. Robert was the one who concerned her the most, not only because of the danger in what he was involved in, though that danger was very real, and she saw it clearly. What troubled her about Robert was something more precise, the distance between his intelligence and his judgment. He was truly a bright young man. She had seen this since he was a child, in the way he read constantly and carefully, with the focus of someone who was not pretending to read for appearance, but actually taking in ideas. He had grown up in a house where the library was full, but mostly for display, and he had worked through much of it by the time he was 15. That was how he came across the ideas that quietly and completely reshaped how he understood the world he had been born into. The issue was that his intelligence had moved faster than his caution. He had become involved with people doing serious and dangerous work, people who acted with care and silence because they fully understood the consequences of being exposed. Robert, who came to these ideas through books rather than lived experience, had not yet developed that deep understanding of consequence. He was careful in the way someone is careful when they understand a rule in their mind, not in the way someone is careful when they have seen what happens to those who are not. The man who had come through the vegetable garden in July had said that Robert was becoming unreliable. He had not explained further, but Dora understood what that meant in this situation. Unreliable did not mean unfaithful. It meant careless, and careless in 1857, Louisiana, was a word that carried consequences far beyond just the person being careless. She had watched Robert at dinner in the weeks after that visit. She noticed how he listened when his father spoke, with a contained intensity that to Gerald might have looked like attention, but to Dora meant something else entirely. She saw the way he sometimes looked down at his plate, instead of at his father's face when certain things were said. The careful control of an expression that wanted to shift. He was moving towards something. She could feel it, the woe. Why? You feel a change before it arrives, like a shift in pressure, and she did not know whether, when it came, it would break cleanly or break everything. Do not go anywhere. What comes next is the part that explains why the story was hidden for 60 years, and why, when it was finally discovered, the people who found it were not sure they should have. Dora could not read. This is important to say clearly because it changes the meaning of what she later did, and because the act itself, the act of writing everything down, required something she did not normally have in her life in 1857. She had never been taught to read. This was not by chance. Louisiana, like all slaveholding states, had laws that banned the formal education of enslaved people, laws that showed a clear understanding from those who made them, that literacy was a kind of power, and power was exactly what the system refused to give to those it enslaved. But Dora had still learned things. She had learned in the way a person learns when the world officially denies them learning, indirectly, through closeness, through the human ability to absorb more than others think possible. She could not read a full page easily, but she could read enough. Over the years, she had learned her letters in the kitchen, near household papers, menus written in Cecil's neat hand and left on the table, lists, notes, labels on jars. She connected these with the sounds she heard, the way a child learns language before formal teaching, through patterns, through context, through repetition. She could write her name. She had learned that in a previous household from another woman who had learned it in the same way. She could write about 40 words with some confidence, words she had practiced in the ash of the kitchen hearth when she was alone, words taken from labels and lists and the occasional scrap of paper that passed through her hands. This was not enough to write a full account, but it was not the only thing she had. There was a boy named Lenny. He was 14 years old in the summer of 1857, and he worked in the Halffield stables. He was small for his age, quick, and had a kind of attention that, in another world, might have been called scholarly. He had learned to read in a way that was both common and hidden in plantation households. He listened to the lessons given to the Halffield children by their tutor, standing outside the schoolroom window while pretending to do small tasks. And he had listened for years with the same steady patience that Dora used when overhearing conversations through open windows. He was better at it than Dora. He had started younger. Dora had known about Lenny's ability to read for about 3 years. She knew because she had seen him reading, not pretending to read, not holding something upside down or turning pages randomly, but truly reading, the way a literate person does, with his eyes moving steadily, and his lips sometimes forming words, and his face reacting to what he understood. She had seen this twice, in moments when he thought no one was watching, and she had said nothing to anyone. She had simply taken note and waited. In the late summer of 1857, she told Lenny what she needed. She was careful in how she spoke. She understood the full weight of what she was asking, not only the risk of the act itself, but also the risk of asking a 14-year-old boy to carry part of that burden. She thought about it for several days before speaking to him. She considered whether there was another way. She could not find one. She went to the stables one evening after the main house had gone in for supper. She explained to him clearly and directly what she needed him to do. She did not hide the risk. She did not pretend it was something simple. She looked at him directly, in a way she knew the adults in that household never did, and she gave him a choice. He said yes. Then he looked at her with those quick, serious eyes and asked, "Where are we going to get the paper?" This was, of course, the main practical problem. Paper on a plantation was not something easily taken. It was kept in the study, in Cecil's writing desk in the parlor, in the schoolroom. Taking enough for what Dora needed would be noticed. It took them 2 weeks to solve it. The answer came from an unexpected place, the inventory of the supply room, which Dora managed, and for which she kept basic written records. This was allowed out of necessity because the kitchen required written inventory for the overseer's accounting, and since Dora ran the kitchen, she was responsible for it. The records she kept were simple, and the paper she used was rough wrapping paper instead of the fine stationery from the study. But it was still paper. She began to collect it slowly, 1 or 2 sheets at a time over 2 weeks in August. She recorded the missing sheets by adjusting the inventory at slightly different times, so the total number still appeared correct when it was checked. It was a small and careful deception, the kind she was capable of, because 18 years of close observation had taught her exactly how often the supply records were checked, and by whom, and with what level of care. By mid-August, she had gathered enough paper. The ink became a different problem, solved more simply. Lenny took a small bottle of writing ink from the schoolroom supply closet, replacing it with a bottle of similar size that he had filled with water colored with kitchen blacking. The replacement was not perfect, but it would not be discovered quickly, and quickly was all they needed. They were ready. She did not write it herself. This is important to understand. Dora dictated, and Lenny Way wrote. They worked in the kitchen house after the main household had gone to sleep, which in summer in Louisiana meant well past 10 o'clock, when the heat of the day finally began to loosen its grip, as the house settled into the quiet sounds of sleep, the creak of beds, the sound of Gerald's light snoring that drifted through the open windows, the eventual silence of even the dogs. The first night they sat for nearly an hour, saying nothing while Dora arranged her thoughts. She had never done anything like this before. She had thoughts. She had memories. She had 18 years of gathered knowledge. But the act of turning that into something ordered and recordable was a different task than simply knowing things, and she needed time to understand the structure she would use. Lenny waited with the patience of a boy who had spent years doing exactly this, waiting, watching, staying still long enough for the world to show him more than it meant to. Eventually, she began. She did not begin with the most dramatic thing. She started at the beginning with what she had seen in the first years after her arrival. The shape of the household as she had first understood it. The personalities as they had first shown themselves to her. This was a choice that reflected something about how she thought, and it made what came later clearer and more terrible. Because by the time she reached the events of 1857, the reader would understand exactly how each person had arrived at the moment they were now in. She spoke quietly and clearly. Lenny wrote quickly in a hand that was not beautiful, but was easy to read. The hand of someone self-taught and practical, aimed at clarity rather than style. They worked for about 2 hours the first night. Then Dora stood, stretched, covered the pages under the loose board in the floor of the kitchen, where she kept the few small things that belonged to her, and went tea. Oh, her sleeping place. They did this for 9 nights. 9 nights. The kitchen house had no clock, but Dora had an internal sense of time that was accurate within a quarter hour, a skill built over years of managing the precise timing that cooking required. She knew how long each night's session lasted. She knew on the 4th night that they had covered about half of what she needed to say. She knew on the 7th night that they were reaching the part that was most dangerous to put on paper. She did not hesitate. She had already decided by the time she sat down on the first night that if she was going to do this at all, she would do it fully. Partial truth, she understood, was just a more complex form of silence, and she had been silent long enough. So she told Lenny about the conversation she had heard through the study window in June. She told him about Cyrus Holt and the nature of the debt, and the men from New Orleans and the figure that had drifted through the open window and settled in her mind like something she had caught in a trap and could not let go. She told him about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked about Robert. She told him about the conversation at the bottom of the staircase, the words through the unlatched study door, and what they had suggested about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions and what Cyrus Holt believed should be done about him. Lenny's hands slowed when she reached this part, not because he struggled with the writing, but because he was thinking about what he was writing, and the thinking took a moment that his hand needed to follow. She waited. He looked up at her. She looked back. She said, "Keep writing." He kept writing. She also told Lenny things she had not told anyone before. She told him about a death. In 1851, a man named Terence had died on the Belhaven plantation. He had been one of the Phi Eld workers, a man in his 40s who had spent years on the plantation, who was respected among the others in the quarters, and who had, in the year before his death, been in possession of information that Dora had known about, and that she believed had contributed in some indirect but real way to what happened to him. She had no proof of this. She was careful to say so when she dictated it. She said, "I do not know it as a fact. I know it as something that feels wrong inside me." But she still put it in the pages because she believed that even what you only partly know deserves to be said when the alternative is that it stays unsaid forever. She told him about a woman named Addie, who had been sold from Belhaven in 1848, under conditions that the official record of the sale, if there even was, one, would have described with the cold neutrality of a property transfer. What those records would not describe was the reason. What those records would not describe was the conversation Dora had overheard 2 weeks before the sale, in the study through the open window, while walking the jasmine path. She had carried Addie's story for 9 years. She placed it in the pages. She told him about the visiting men from New Orleans, not just that they came, but what she had noticed about their nature, the quality of their patience, the way they looked at the plantation and its people in a way that was different from how planters or business partners look at property, a way that told her something about the nature of the arrangement, though she could not have clearly named what it was. She told him about a document she had seen, not read, because she could not fully read it, but seen clearly enough to describe its physical details, the letterhead, the signature at the bottom, the shape and layout of the text in a way that she believed, combined with what she had heard, would be understood by Mion who could read. She told him about the small and steady ways in which the accounting of the plantation had, over the years, she had been there, been arranged to show a picture of the operation that was slightly but consistently different from the reality she saw and lived. She told him about a man named August Fry. August Fry was a name Dora had heard once in passing, in a conversation between Gerald Hatfield and a man she did not recognize who had arrived at the plantation in the late winter of 1855. She had been walking the jasmine path. She was always walking the jasmine path, and she sometimes felt that the most important place on the entire plantation was those 40 feet of covered walkway, and the name had drifted down to her from the open study window with the particular weight of a name that the speaker had thought about before saying. Gerald had said the name once, and the other man had answered. And then Gerald had said something that included the word arrangement, and then they had moved to another part of the room, or lowered their voices enough that the path gave nothing more. She had kept the name August Fry. She did not know who he was, or what the arrangement meant, but names that are spoken with that kind of care, in that tone, in that company, she had learned to remember them. She had learned that sometimes the value of a thing is not clear until later, until it joins with something else, the way two simple ingredients can create something new. She placed the name in the pages. She would not know until much later, until events that the pages themselves would set into motion, whether August Fry was someone who mattered. But she wrote him down because she had learned to trust the weight of certain things. On the 9th night, she dictated the final section. It was different in tone, not softer, but more personal. She told Lenny to write exactly what she said, not to change or improve it, even if what she said was not written the way a book would be written. She said, "My name is Dora. I have lived on this plantation for 18 years. Everything I have written here is true, as I know truth to be, which is what I have seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. I am not a person the law would give any authority to, and I understand what that means for these pages. But I am writing them because keeping things inside you when they matter, when they involve people being treated wrongly, the keeping of it becomes its own kind of harm. I have been careful my whole life. Tonight, I am choosing something different from careful." She paused. Lenny waited. She said, "Anyone who finds this, I ask you to think about all the things that were never written down, because the person who knew them was not supposed to know how to write. Think about all the pages that were never made. I made these. That is what I can do." She sat for a moment after she finished. Then she said, "Put the date." Lenny wrote the date. August 22nd, 1857. Dora had known for several weeks before the writing began where she planned to hide the pages. The chest had been in the kitchen house since before she arrived at Belhaven. It was an old oak chest, heavy, marked from years of use and rough handling, used for storing dry goods, dried beans and rice, and the kind of supplies that kept well and needed to be protected from rodents. The chest was not locked because it did not hold anything that anyone in the main household thought worth locking away. Its inside was divided by a thick wooden insert that sat about 2/3 of the way down, creating an upper section reached through the lid, and a lower section that appeared, from a quick look, to be the solid base of the chest. It was not the solid base of the chest. Someone, she did not know who or when, had made the insert removable, not obviously removable, not in a way that would be noticed unless you already knew to look, but removable. The insert was not fixed. It simply rested on a wooden edge that ran around the inside of the chest, held in place by its weight and by whatever was stored above it. Remove those items, lift out the insert, and there was a narrow space beneath, maybe about 4 inches deep, stretching across the full inside of the chest. A space that was basically invisible to anyone not searching for it. Dora had discovered this space in her second year at Belhaven, when she dropped a dried bean that rolled away and slipped behind the insert. She reached in to get it back, and her hand found that hidden gap. She told no one. She put the insert back, replaced the beans, and kept the knowledge to herself. For 15 years that space stayed empty. Now it would hold the pages. She wrapped them in a piece of oiled cloth she had saved from a supply delivery, the kind used to wrap tools for storage, something that would keep the paper safe from the dampness that was unavoidable in a Louisiana kitchen. She folded the cloth carefully around the pages, tied it with a piece of kitchen twine, and placed it in the hidden space under the insert. She set the insert back, replaced the bags of dried rice and beans, and closed the lid. She looked at the chest for a moment. She felt something she did not quite have a word for. Not exactly relief, not exactly satisfaction, not exactly fear, but something that held all of these and none of them at once. The feeling of having done something that cannot be undone, when undoing was never the intention. She went to bed. September arrived in the way Louisiana Septembers do, not with any real cooling, that's still weeks away, but with a different kind of light, a slightly changed angle that made the afternoon shadows longer and gave the evening a sense of something ending. Dora watched the household closely in those first days of September. She watched because things had been shifting in the weeks since Cyrus Holt arrived, and the shift was speeding up. She could sense it in the tone of conversations at the dinner table, in the way Gerald spoke more carefully than usual, choosing his words with a precision that was not his normal direct style. The care of a man deciding what to say and what to hold back. She could sense it in Philip's absences, which had become more frequent and less explained. She could see it in Cecily's posture at meals, the specific stillness of a woman preparing for something. And she could feel it most clearly in Robert, who had grown very quiet over the past 2 weeks. Robert's quiet was not the calm of someone at peace. It was the silence of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the right time to act. She recognized that kind of silence because she had lived in it herself all summer. On the 5th of September, a letter arrived for Gerald Haverfield. She knew it mattered, not from its contents, which she did not see, but from what happened in the house afterward. Gerald received it in the morning, read it in his study with the door shut, then went to find Cyrus Holt, who was staying in the guest room at the back of the main house. She knew Gerald had gone there because she heard him on the back staircase. She recognized his footsteps exactly, 18 years having made her familiar with how each person in the house moved, and then she heard him knock and enter. The conversation behind that door lasted about 40 minutes. When Gerald came out, he went straight to the stables and asked for a horse. He rode out within the hour and did not return until after supper. When he came back, he ate in his study from a tray instead of joining the dinner table, which was unusual enough that Cecily came to the kitchen to ask Dora if something was wrong with the food, because she was worried about Gerald and looking for a reason that did not require asking him directly. Dora said the food was fine. She said Mr. Haverfield had likely had a long day. Cecily looked at her with an expression that was not quite what it seemed, not just a simple question about dinner, then nodded and went back to the main house. Dora stood by the kitchen fire and stirred the pot. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. On the 9th of September, Philip left for New Orleans. This was not unusual by itself. He went often, but the way he left this time was different. He left early, before breakfast, without the usual goodbye to his mother, without giving instructions to the staff, without any of the normal habits of departure. He simply left. Dora learned he was gone because one of the girls from the main house mentioned it in the kitchen that morning. Unsure if she should still prepare his room, she told the girl to prepare it as usual. Then she stood for a moment, thinking about what his sudden departure meant in the middle of everything else happening, and she decided it meant he knew something was coming, and had chosen distance as his response. Philip Haverfield, in her long understanding of him, was not someone who stayed when things became hard. He left. He had been leaving for years in both small and large ways. This was just the clearest version of a pattern she had watched since he was old enough to choose. On the 12th of September, Robert came to the kitchen. He did not come for food. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in a way he rarely did, with the look of someone truly seeing instead of just glancing. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said yes. He came in and sat at the corner of the work table, where the light from their window was strongest. He was quiet for a moment, then said something she would later write down in her own words, in a letter sent through a channel she would not name, a letter that became part of a later archive, which is why we know what he said. He said, "Dora, I need you to understand that whatever happens in the next few weeks, I will make sure the people in the quarters know what they need to know to make the right choices." He paused. "I need you to know that I understand it matters." She looked at him and asked what was going to happen. He looked at his hands and said he did not know everything, but that things were going to change. She said, "Things always change, Mr. Robert." He looked up and said, "Not like this." She did not tell him about the pages. She looked at him and thought of the 14-year-old boy in the stables who had written them, and of the oiled cloth in the hidden space, and the oak chest, and of the 15 years that space had stayed empty until now. She said, "I know." He left. She went back to the fire. On the 14th of September, two things happened. First, a stranger arrived at the plantation in the late morning on a hired horse carrying a document that required Gerald Haverfield's signature. That meant he had to be admitted to the study, which meant Dora was told by the girl at the front entrance so she could prepare a tray. Dora prepared it, walked through the house, placed it on the hallway table outside the study, and knocked. Gerald said, "Come." She entered, set the tray down, and left. The whole action took about 45 seconds. In that time, she saw the stranger clearly, saw the document partly unrolled on the desk, and saw Gerald's face. The stranger was from Baton Rouge. She did not know it for certain, but she was almost sure, based on the small details she noticed, one she could not explain without saying more than she wished. Gerald's expression was that a man receiving something he feared, forced to do so in front of a witness, unable to show what he felt. She left the room, walked down the hall, and returned to the kitchen. The second thing that happened that day was that Cyrus Holt left Belhaven. He left quietly in the afternoon with his horse and leather satchel. He said goodbye to no one that Dora knew of. He was simply there and then gone, which itself meant something. You have come this far with us. What happens next is the part that explains why these pages were hidden for so many years. Stay with us. The household seemed to hold its breath. Dora had never felt a tension like this before, not even during the difficult times of earlier years, not during the financial troubles of 1853, or the sickness that spread through the quarters in 1855 and took 4 lives in 6 weeks. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that comes before something major, not just another hard season, but something that would change everything. She kept cooking. She kept walking the jasmine path. Each time she walked it, she listened through the open windows, open because it was still September in Louisiana, and the heat had not yet eased. Gerald had grown quiet in a new way, not his usual reserved nature. He stayed in the study most of the day and into the evening, which was not unusual, but his presence felt heavier, more concentrated, like the air before a storm breaks. The house felt heavier around him. Cecily was writing more letters than Dora had ever seen her write. Working quickly at the parlor desk with steady focus, she sealed them herself, carried them to the front door, and handed them directly to the houseboy to take into town, which was unusual. She normally left outgoing letters on the front table. She was not using the usual way anymore. Robert was away for most of the day. He left early and came back late, walking instead of riding a horse, and he entered through the back door instead of the front, which told her something about where he had gone, and more importantly, who he had been with. On the 18th of September, 3 men arrived who had not been invited for supper, yet they ended up sitting in the dining room for 3 hours. Dora prepared food for them. She sent it up through the back stairs as she always did. She waited in the kitchen while they ate and talked. Later she returned to clear, as usual. When she came in, the men were still sitting at the table. She moved through the room the way she always did, efficiently, quietly, without the kind of presence that demands attention. She cleared the plates. She placed the dessert course. She refilled glasses. The conversation carried on around her with small breaks, not quite silence, but a slight shift, a narrowing of what was being said while she was there. This was the usual change people made when she was nearby, a balance between wanting to speak openly and knowing she was there, usually settling on the idea that her presence was the same as absence. But she was not absent. What she caught in those small pauses and shifts was the shape of a situation that by September of 1857 had become something she had not fully expected, even with everything she already knew. The document from the stranger on the 14th had not been what she first thought. It was not from the man in Baton Rouge. It had come from a completely different direction. It related to another part of Gerald Hatfield's arrangement, the part that involved August Fry. She heard the name. She heard it spoken with the same careful tone she had first heard in 1855, and now it had meaning. And that meaning made the 2 years of keeping that name feel suddenly heavy and almost overwhelming. August Fry was an agent. He worked in different ways, changing loyalties easily, for several interests, and the interest he had most recently served had been investigating the arrangement between Gerald Haverfield and the men from New Orleans for nearly 2 years. She cleared the table. She went back into the kitchen. She stood near the fire and thought about a name she had held on to for 2 years, and what it meant that it had finally shown its true nature. On the 22nd of September, Robert did not return home. He had left that morning as usual, on foot through the back, and by supper he had not come back, and by the time the house closed for the night and the lamps were put out, he was still gone. Gerald did not send anyone to search for him. This detail told her everything. In a house where the heir's movements had always been watched closely by parents who understood that their son's actions affected the family's reputation, the lack of a search was not an accident. Gerald knew where Robert was, or at least had a general idea of what had happened to him, and he had chosen, whatever the feeling behind that choice, to let him stay gone. She did not sleep well that night. In the days that followed, the plantation seemed normal on the surface. The cane had reached a stage in the season that needed careful attention. The kitchen continued to produce 3 meals a day. The daily routine went on, as always. But beneath that surface, Dora could feel things changing. Cecily received a letter that made her stop pretending, at least for an afternoon. She sat in the parlor with the letter resting in her lap, and her hand still, and her face showing something she could not smooth back into its usual calm expression, before Dora passed through the hall with a tray and saw her. Dora set the tray down and left without being dismissed, which was unusual, and Cecily did not call her back. October arrived. Philip did not come back from New Orleans. Robert had sent word, not to the main house but to the quarters, through channels that had their own system and speed, that he was safe, and that certain things should be understood, and certain decisions made because of it. Dora did not hear this directly from Robert, but from others who had heard from others, in the way information traveled in parts of the plantation, that the main house never noticed as having their own networks. Gerald Hatfield received several more documents during October. She knew this from the steady flow of men carrying satchels coming through the front door, and from the heavy silence Gerald carried into the few meals he still ate in the dining room. He had stopped riding out in the mornings. He had stopped going into town. He remained on the property with the feeling of a man who was not staying by his own choice. Cyrus Hall did not return. In the first week of November, 2 men arrived with a document that was unlike the others. They were not from New Orleans. They were not the type of men who handled the kind of dealings that had taken place in that study for years. They were official men, in the way officials appeared in Louisiana in 1857. Their clothing, the way they sat on their horses, the formality in their speech when they came to the front door and asked to speak with Mr. Gerald Hatfield, all marked them clearly. Dora was in the kitchen when they arrived. She knew they had come from the sound, the distinct sound of officials carrying documents, which is different from ordinary visitors. She did not walk the Jasmine path that morning. She did not need to. She knew with a deep certainty, from watching a pattern slowly complete itself over months, that what she had overheard through the open window of that study in June and July, and near the bottom of the back stairs, through an unlatched door was now being heard by men who had the power to act on it. She stood by the fire and felt something she examined closely because she was unsure of its nature. It was not exactly satisfaction. It was not quite justice. It was something softer than both, and more complex. It was the sense of a record being formed. Gerald Hatfield left Belhaven in November of 1857, under circumstances that the official records of the time describe in the dry, precise language of legal procedure. The details are not fully clear, because records from that period often carried the same gaps Dora had noticed in the records of her own life. Information was kept when it served those in power and left out when it did not. What the records do show is that by early 1858, Belhaven was going through major change. Legal actions had begun that, over time, led to outcomes that were imperfect, as such things often were in that time and place. But they were not without effect. Robert Hatfield's name appears later in different records and in different situations. He is connected with people and actions that his family would have strongly rejected, and he seems to have continued in that direction without caring about their judgment. Philip eventually returned to Louisiana, but not to Belhaven. Cecily went back to Virginia. The letters she had written to her sister in Richmond, arranged through a contact in Baton Rouge, and sent through a route that avoided the official post, later showed themselves to be part of a careful plan for exactly this result. Cecily Hatfield, with the same efficiency she applied to everything, had made her preparations. She was a practical woman. Dora remained at Belhaven during the period of change. This is one of the details made clear in the pages, or more precisely, in the later account she sent through another channel, a letter that reached an archive and was eventually connected through careful study in the 1970s and 80s to the pages themselves. She stayed because the kitchen needed to function, and the people in the quarters depended on it. The disorder of a failing plantation had very real effects on those with the least protection, and she was not willing to add to that by leaving. She cooked, she managed the kitchen, she made sure there was food, and she waited. The pages themselves were discovered in 1923. The kitchen house at what had once been the Belhaven Plantation had stood since the 1840s. It had survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the many years after, existing like most old outbuildings that were no longer used for their original purpose, sometimes maintained, slowly wearing down, and occasionally used for storage. The main house had burned in 1871. The cause was officially recorded as accidental, though there were people nearby who had their own version of events, which was never formally written down. The kitchen house did not burn. In 1923, a woman named Agnes Turod, a schoolteacher in East Baton Rouge Parish, and the granddaughter of a woman who had lived in the quarters at Belhaven and had been among those Dora cooked for during the transition period, was helping to clear the old structure, which was being taken down to make space for a new building on land that had passed through many hands since the 1860s. Agnes discovered the chest. She found it because it was too heavy to move easily, and when she looked into why it was so heavy, she found the insert. And when she removed that insert, she found the hidden space below. And inside that space, she found the oiled cloth. And within the oiled cloth, she found the pages. She could read. Her grandmother had made sure of that. She sat down on the floor of the old kitchen house, with the pages resting in her lap, and she read them. It took her most of the afternoon. When she finished, she remained still for a long time in the dusty light of the old building, holding the pages in her hands. Then she made a decision that would take years to fully carry out, that would force her to deal with institutions not built to accept what she had found, that would cost her more time and effort, and even moments of grief, than she had expected when she first sat on that floor. She decided to make sure the pages would survive. Here is what we know, and what we do not know, and the space between these two is where this story continues to exist. We know that Dora existed. Agnes Turod's account of finding the pages, written in a journal she kept from the 1920s through the 1950s, is detailed and specific and has been reviewed by people trained to examine such things. The pages themselves, or rather photographs and typed versions of them, because the originals are fragile and kept under careful conditions to ensure their preservation, have been studied by scholars of Southern history, archivists, and historians specializing in that period. The question of their authenticity has been closely examined. The paper, the ink, the writing, all match the materials and methods available in 1850s Louisiana. The handwriting shows traits of a self-taught writer, which fits Lenny's profile. The content includes specific details, names, financial numbers, arrangements, and the name August Frey that have been cross-checked with other records from the time, official records that the pages co.